know that this is the end of that particular cycle. We actually need... So now that we have our character in Cinema 4D and we have extended the animation, we now want to just continue refining it and making sure that it loops perfectly. And this is very important because later on when we start to build other objects in the scene, everything needs to match up in order for the looping to work. So the reason I chose 16 seconds as the duration is because that's roughly the amount of time it takes this character running at this speed to travel across 5,000 centimeters in the scene, or 50 meters. This model is to scale, so I was really thinking in those terms. So if I bring in a plane object, and let's go to display and go to ground shading with lines so we can just see a bit better. I will set this size to 5,000 centimeters. And if I go to the Z position, let's change this to 2500, which means that the edge of the plane starts where the character started moving from also. And this distance here is what we're going to build the rest of the loop around and all the objects in the scene. And when we get to those lessons in this class, it will make more sense why it's so important for the character to cover exactly that distance. For now, let's just make sure that is what's happening. At the end of the animation here, we can see the character hasn't quite made it. So we have to give the character more time. To extend the timeline, I have to go down here and click this very small arrow next to the original duration. It's the up arrow, and keep extending this. And from my previous experiment, I know this is about 17 seconds and 5 frames. Now you can see that I have overshot that point. Really, it should stop about here. But now what's happening is the run cycle is not matching up with the total duration. This is about halfway through the run cycle. It's the other leg which should be planted here instead of the one that's currently there. If I scrub through to the end, this is the point at which the run cycle is complete. And just to double check that is the case, if I go back to the timeline and let's look at any one of these tracks, let's say position X. This here is the end of the current duration. And if I go to the repetitions of this, drop it down to 17, you can see it's right on that line. If I extend this further, it goes beyond. So I know that this is the end of that particular cycle. We actually need just one more frame here so that the entire line is within this side of our duration. So let's bring that up by 1, and now it's contained within. So with the current animation on the character and the speed he's moving at, it's impossible to hit that point exactly. So we could extend the space our loop is going to take place in to that point, but now we have this very awkward number which is not round. This would make things harder later when we're trying to arrange other objects into the scene. Much easier to stick to a nice round number like 5,000. So how do we make this work? Well, this is where we can bring in that other character. And this time, instead of dragging and dropping, let's file and merge objects with the other character. So this is the in place, and click open. And once again, just hit OK. Now this is way over here at the beginning of the scene, or in the center of the scene. So I'm going to select the joints for that character, and I will press S, and that will jump to that exact point in the scene. Let's give this character the same treatment. We'll create a new null object and call this run number 2. At frame 0, let's drop everything into here. Let's call this joints run 2 also. And then I will go to the top null object and rotate it on its heading to be 180 degrees. So now that we have this second character with the same run cycle except it's in the same spot, we also want to go to the timeline and repeat those keyframes, and this time we're just repeating all of them. There is nothing to offset because there is no motion to offset in that direction either. So we'll just go to the after control with all of these tracks selected and change this to repeat, and once again repeat this 17 times. And if I play this quickly, you can see the animation has been extended. For the movement, we are going to do this ourselves. So if I go and open up position Z of the main joint, the main parent joint, let's click that track only, press S to jump to those keyframes, and you can see, even though it looks like there's a lot going on here, even if I remove it, there will not be much of a difference. It looks exactly the same. But now what I can do is simply animate this to go from 0 to 5000. So at frame 0, we'll go to the position Z of this joint, set a keyframe at 0. So hold Control and click this circle right here, and that sets a keyframe. Let's move to the last frame in our animation and set the final position to 5000 and save that keyframe also. And actually it needs to be negative 5000 because we are sort of working backwards here and then flipping everything with this null at the top. So just be aware of that. It eases in so it doesn't keep up with the other character. Let's go to window and timeline again and look at that one keyframe on its own. And we can zoom out here the same way we do in the viewport by holding 2 so we can see the entire track. And if I press it again and make sure it's linear using this switch up here, now you can see it will keep up with the other one because it moves at a constant speed. And if I continue to watch, you will see both characters will stop at the end here. The difference is our second character will stop in exactly the spot we determined, which is 5000 centimeters. And this is technically the wrong thing, because at the speed this character was moving, he should be over there, because that's where he ends up if we don't change anything. But if we zoom out and look at the scene as a whole, this difference here is very small compared to the overall size of the scene, so that's why we can get away with this. It means that this character here technically will be sliding on every stride, just a slight amount, but the difference is so small that in this case we can get away with it, and it allows us to precisely place the character where we want him to begin and stop. So that's a lot of setup of just the movement of the character, but this will all sort of come together later when we start to build the other elements in the scene and making it all loop seamlessly. So as you saw there, we spent a lot of time just making sure that the character traveled a very specific distance. You will see why this is very important when we get to other lessons in the class. This lesson is very simple. We're just going to set up our camera animation and making sure that it also loops. Both characters are still in this scene. So over here, I can go to the first character, and these two dots, the one at the top, if I click that twice, will hide this character in the viewport, and the second dot will hide it in the actual render itself. These are called traffic lights in Cinema 4D, and you can use them to selectively hide objects and so on. Anyway, for our camera, we are going to get a new camera from up here. Let's look through this by selecting that small square. And let's go to the rotation of this and make sure it's reset to 0 degrees. Do the same for the X position. The Y position should be about halfway the height of the character. If I click on this second character, down here we can find out its total height by changing this control from size to size plus. And I can now see the height is 176 centimeters. So I would just copy this number, go to the camera, and in its coordinates, let's put that number in, but divide it by 2. So /2, and we end up with 88.181. The Z position is going to be -400. Now the camera itself needs to be much wider at 12mm. This is in the camera's object settings, and I am going to angle it up so that our character is closer to the base of the frame. About 20 degrees. This is roughly the same angle we have in the original example. For our camera to follow the character, we are going to create a new null object. Let's call this camera number 1. Place our camera into this. We can look out, so we have an overview of the whole scene. Let's animate this null to move the camera. I'm already in the coordinates of this null object. At frame 0, I would just keyframe the Z position. So hold Control and click the keyframe. Go to the end of the animation and type in 5,000, which again is the same distance we have here. So this will have an easy ease interpolation on the keyframes. So let's go to Window and Timeline. And now we have this extra camera with the new animated track. Let's select that and make it linear. Now, if we play this back, you can see the camera stays a constant speed behind our character because both of these objects are moving at the same speed. We can look through this and see what that's like. Skip to the end here. And if we turn off the floor, you will see this is actually now looping because of that setup we spent so much time doing earlier. And the reason I use a null object to carry the camera is because we can always then go back to the camera's coordinates and change those without affecting its overall movement, because that's being done up here. Anyway, that's how to quickly set up the camera for our scene. Okay, we are now going to start building the other objects you see in the scene, starting with the pillars that you see in the animation. For the pillars, let's start with a cube. And I will set its size to 500 by 500. Let's go to the cube's object properties and let's click fillet. And this is going to round the edges. We actually don't want round edges though. So I will go to the fillet radius, or rather the subdivision, and set this to 1. So it's a flat, sharp edge. And then I'll set the radius just to be a bit larger. So 10 centimeters. And I can see some smoothing attempt by Cinema 4D. This is called the Phong tag. So if I click this this two spheres, this two sphered icon, and the Phong angle, let's drop this to about 20. And now we have this sharp edge. Alternatively, you could just remove the Phong tag entirely. Let's take that cube, place it inside of a cloner. Just grab a cloner, bring this in here. The mode will remain as linear because we do just want to clone in a straight line. And it's going to be a straight line going up. So let's go to the mode, which will stay as per step. And in previous versions of Cinema 4D, I think you don't have this per step mode. You sort of have a single other mode, which is similar to endpoint in new versions of Cinema, but in old versions, it's just, I think it's just labeled scale or something like that. Anyway, whatever number that ends up being, we just need it to be so that these cubes end up stacking on top of each other like this. Now in per step mode, it's very easy because you just set the distance between each clone, which in this case is 500. That's the size of each cube, right? So if I set that to 500, and then we simply set the count to anything we want. It's going to be 30 for this one. And it just creates a nice, neat stack of cubes like this. If I change to endpoint, where we set the overall scale, which in this case will be 14,500, and then increasing the count sort of fills in the spaces in between. But essentially it's the same thing. Anyway, let's move on. This is going to be the cloner pillars, which are slanted to the right. So I'm just abbreviating here, cloner SR. And I will go to the position of this and set it to 1000. This is for the X position, so moving it to the right side here. And I will slant it by going to the rotation banking in the coordinates section here. So the banking is going to be 35 degrees. Let's make a copy of this, hold Control and just drag down. This is going to be cloner slanted left. And I will flip both the rotation, so negative 35 and negative 1000 for the position. Let's make another copy and this will be cloner upright to the right. Set the X position to 5000. The banking will be removed entirely, so set to 0 because this will be perfectly upright. And then I'm going to move it to 625 in Z space so that it's offset from the slanted cloners and there's just a small gap in between. If it seems like I'm just pulling numbers out of nowhere, I'm not. I've done this project at least 2 or 3 times before when I was preparing for the tutorial. So these are the numbers I used when I built those other scenes. And if you want to build the exact same thing I am building, you should use the same numbers. Of course, you should, or I do encourage that you actually experiment with different looks and see if you can come up with something different. But generally speaking, I'm not just getting these numbers out of nowhere. Make another copy of that. Once again, just hold Control, click and drag down. And let's flip the X position this time to -5000. So we end up with this very odd looking abstract sort of shape. And now I want to group all of those cloners into a single null object, which I will call pillars. Let's just bring that in there. So now they will move as a single object. And I want to clone this also. And here's a quick tip. If you select any object in Cinema 4D when you're inserting another object and hold the Alt key, that new object will automatically become a parent of the object you previously had selected. So you don't have to do it manually, like, bring in the cloner and then do this. It just inherits the position and rotation data of whatever you had selected and becomes the parent. Anyway, just a quick tip there. In the object settings of this cloner, we are using the linear mode once again. In per step mode, this time we are moving in the Z direction. And the distance between each set of clones is going to be 1 to 50. Let's have just 4. And just to make sure that this starts flush with our 50 by 50 plane, let's go to the cloner, and in the coordinates tab, let's go to the position and set this to 250. And you can see it lines up perfectly with the edge of the floor. Once again, I'm hoping that it's becoming more and more apparent why it was so crucial that this section be 5000 by 5000. It just makes the setup for the rest of the scene much easier because you are using nice whole numbers all the time. Okay, I have inserted a new null object here, which I am going to call section. In this section, I am going to drop the floor and our cloned pillars. So we have this kind of thing now where everything besides the character and the camera moves as one object. And with the section null selected, I can go to this icon. Let's get the instance, and this is with the null object selected over here so that the link is created automatically. And an instance just means a copy. So this will now copy whatever is happening inside of here. For example, if I go to the floor and drop the number of segments to 10 by 10, you can see the instance over here updates automatically. And I'm also going to set the width of the floor to be much wider. Let's go for 25,000. This new instance, or this new copy, its position is going to be exactly 5,000. And now you can see, once again, because we set that up properly, it lines up perfectly with the first segment. So what does this look like? Well, if we jump into the camera, you can now see this starts to resemble the kind of view we're looking at in this example, but we just need more of this going into the distance. And this is where these instances will really help us. So if I make another copy of that instance, and then move the position of this new instance to 10,000. So each time I am just going up by 5,000 centimeters. So this will now be 15,000, and so on and so on. So let's just go ahead and let's put in 7 total. So there's currently 4 instances plus the original, that's 6. I'm going to make a copy of the last one here, and this one will be actually set to negative 5,000. So it starts behind the character, because before I did that, if I jump into the camera at frame 0, we don't have anything in front of the or behind the character here. So that's what that is there. And just to be safe, we'll make another copy and make it negative 10,000. So now we have, you know, numerous pillars like this, and because of the way we set up the scene, what the camera is looking at this point in the animation is basically the same as what the camera is looking at this point at the end. So if I let this play through, and the scene will start to slow down a bit because we have so many objects. You see it jumps back to the beginning. Of course, there is a slight glitch, because at the beginning it's looking down, was it 4 set of instances? But at the end, after traveling through one of the instances, it's only now looking at 3. So there's 1 less, and that's why there is that slight glitch. But it's not a problem, because if you look in the final animation, instead of just jumping at the end, I came up with this idea where these are constantly being sort of spawned or coming out of the ground, and that's what completes the seamless loop. So I will show you the setup for that in the following lesson, and we'll once again be continuing with the rest of the elements that you see in the scene. So with the pillars in place, we now want to do the cascading effect, which you see in the animation where the character is, walking down or running down this path, and then you see the pillars coming up at the end. Before we fix this jump we see at the end of our loop here, there is one other thing I missed, which is randomizing the position of these pillars. If I click the cloners at this level, so the 4 different set of pillars that we set up earlier, let's go to MoGraph, Effector, and Random. By default, it affects the position of the cubes, which is what we want, just not in the Y direction. So let's just drop that to 0, but we'll leave X and Z at 50, and it just displaces the position of the cubes slightly. And we have something that looks a bit more, I think looks more interesting than just purely some straight lines. But once again, this is one of those creative decisions that you can change for your own scene. Let's make a quick comparison between this here. You see these pillars are constantly shifting. We don't have that yet in this scene. We just have a jump, and that's destroying the illusion of the loop. So this solution actually is something that I came up with, and it's one of those things which ended up being a technical solution to a problem and also looked really cool creatively. Now the setup for this will be quite different in the latest version of Cinema 4D, which is version 21 at the time of this recording. So starting with how this works in Cinema 4D R21, at this level, this cloner here, which clones these pillars into the 4 sections, let's select that cloner and go to MoGraph, Effector, and Plane. And the Plane Effector just applies equally to everything. So if I go to the position here, I want to set, and this is in the parameter tab of the Plane Effector, I want to set this to negative 10,000, and it's going to push everything down into the floor. What I want to do is to only affect certain clones down in the distance over here. I have to use what's called a Falloff field. In R21, you go to the end here and click Falloff, and let's click linear field. So this is going to create a falloff of how this effect is applied in a linear direction. So I will set the length of this field to be 1000, and the direction of this linear field is going to be the Z direction, so Z plus. And when I do that, you will see a shift in the way that the clones are being arranged. And now if I move this out in front of the camera, you can see as it passes through, it is actually moving the pillars up from under the floor, which is what the plane effector up here is doing. This is pushing them down by 10,000 centimeters. And then the way we are mapping that is by using this linear field. So everything behind is back to its original position. Everything in front is below. And then as this passes through, it creates this animation. So if you're working in earlier versions of Cinema 4D, you'll be keenly aware that whatever you're trying to do right now is not going to look like what I just did here, but we'll get to that shortly. Let's complete this this effect. If I go to the end of the animation, let's just push this as far as it goes without moving that last line of columns. Maybe about here. Actually, I might even bring it back even further. Let's just put a nice number of, let's say, 20,000. And then I will take this plane effector and place it into the same null object that the camera is in. So now it's going to move at the same rate as our camera. And what this looks like from within the camera is that the pillars out there in the distance are constantly growing and filling out the scene. And it's a nice looking effect. And also it makes sure that our scene is going to loop seamlessly. Now there is a slight stop because of just the way the animation has to recalculate and start again. But if we render this out and output the final animation, this would be a nice smooth loop. Anyway, once this is set up, you can do things like change the length of the linear field, and this is going to change the smoothness of how these pillars are coming up. Currently, it's almost like one by one row at a time. If I lengthen the timeline to, or the length of this field rather, to 2000 centimeters, which is double, now it's more gradual. There's always like 2 or 3 rows moving at a time, and that's a different creative effect. But I quite like what we have here, sort of one by one. I think that's very similar to what I had in this version. Anyway, that's something you can play around and experiment with and see what you can achieve. All right. So in this short lesson, I'm just going to go over how the plane effector and falloff used to look in earlier versions of Cinema 4D. If I select the cloner here, the one that created the set of 4 once again, if I go to MoGraph effector and plane, and let's go to the parameter tab, I will once again set the Y position to -10,000. So up to this point, it's the same, exact same as in R21. But let's go to the Falloff tab. And instead of having a separate fields section down here, you simply have a shape control. So the shape is going to be linear. Orientation needs to be Z minus this time instead of Z plus. So it operates a bit differently, but you can now see this is essentially the same effect. Length is controlled by these 3 size boxes. We only want the Z direction size. So let's set the size Z to 1000. You've got X, Y, and Z. So if I set that to 1000, you can now see Oops, I just knocked it to 10,000. You can see this sort of, yellow, red, and yellow again squares, and they represent the fall-off range. Now for this, actually, I need to set this to 100%. So we just have a single straight line fall-off. And also the function is going to be set to linear so that we have a fall-off which applies equally across the entire width of this fall-off. Okay, I don't know if that made any sense, but just use these settings and this is what's going to give you the same result as we just did earlier in R21. Once again, I will position this at about 20,000 in Z space to start with, which is nearly at the end here. Go to the end of our animation and then make this plane effector a child of the same null object which is carrying our camera, so that when we do look through the camera, this is now moving with it and constantly revealing those pillars out there in the distance. And if I play this through at the end here, it loops back to the beginning. Now we're going to create the rest of the other objects in the scene, and we'll do the initial setup for the galaxy that you see in the distance. The other two elements in the scene are these things at the side and the galaxy itself. So let's start with the side bits. These were created using the landscape object. So if I go to the primitives icon, let's get the landscape. I will go to the width and height segments. Let's lower that to 40 and 40. And the size will be set to 1 to 50. I will just change the X value, press enter, and it automatically scales up the entire thing. If you want to individually just scale up one side, you have to go and do this up here in the object settings. So I will go for the height. Let's set this to 300. I can see there is some smoothing taking place. So let's go to the landscape object and remove the Fong tag, and that creates this much sharper looking object. If I go to the landscape object, I will go to the sea level setting and I will drop this or increase it to 70%. If I slide this up and down, you can see the effect that has. I'm going to temporarily hide the other instances, so we just have the original section on its own. And this is something you can do if you just want to speed up, your movement around the scene. You can turn this off and then turn them back on when you're ready to output the project or move on to something else. So let's take this landscape object and place it inside of a cloner. This time we will use grid array mode. We want 2 in the X direction and 5 in the Z direction. And if I start to scale this, if I just grab one of these scaling points, I don't know why it's not letting me do this. Okay, here we go. We can scale it out like this. Now I know the actual number needs to be 2000 for X and 1000 for Z. This is in the per step mode. If we go to endpoint mode, it's 2000 and 4000. The position here needs to be set to 2500 in Z space so that it's in the center along with everything else. Here I will go to MoGraph effector and random. With the cloner selected, it means that this will automatically be put into the effectors section of our cloner. Okay, we don't want to change the position, only the rotation. So let's go and turn that on. This is in the parameters tab of the effector. And we just want to randomize the heading rotation. I will set this to 360, which means the rotation of our clones will be somewhere between 0 and 360. And it makes it look like we have several different types of shapes, but it's just the same shape spun around to look different. Okay, so the other part of that are these edges you see, sort of an outline effect. It's more obvious where there are some reflections. So that was created using the atom array object in Cinema 4D. This is found under the same menu as the instance. And on its own, it's not going to do anything. So let's create a copy of our cloner setup, or here just the instance. So with the cloner selected, let's get an instance object and then drop this instance into the atom array. And when I do that, you will now see this outline effect. This is made up of two parts. If I click on the atom array, the cylinder here controls the width of these lines in between, and the sphere radius here controls the size of the joint in between. I think we need something like 0.5 for the cylinder radius and 2 for the sphere radius, and then subdivisions I will lower down to 5 just to speed things up a bit. And then I'm going to take all of these elements and drop them into a null object. So this is going to be the cloner, its random effector, and the atom array. And if I go to the coordinates of this null object, let's first of all, let's call it side section, and I will go to the coordinates and lower the y position to -2.5 just to make sure that it sinks below the floor so we don't have these edges sticking out. If I then take all of this, place it inside of our section null, the main section null, this entire thing here, and then I will re-enable the instances, and you can see that it has been automatically updated across the entire length of our scene. Looking through the camera, this is what it looks like. It's not large enough, so let's go to the original cloner. In the transform tab, let's go to X, Y, and Z and just bump these up to, let's say, 1.4, 1.4, and 1.4. And this will make the whole effect larger and more obvious. So that's how we make the sections on the side. The last element is the galaxy itself. This is going to be placed on a disk shape. So if I go to the cube icon, hold left click and get the disk, we are going to make sure it's upright. So set the orientation to Z+, and this is in the object properties. The size of this, if I recall correctly, it should be 65,000. It needs to be about 30,000 in the distance, 22,500 in the up direction. Okay, I've done this before, so I remember those numbers. And then if I go to my project folder, I have this material or this texture. It's just an image of the Milky Way galaxy. Let's drop this into our materials box over here. Just click no and apply that over there. The preview of this is very blurry, so let's open up the material. Just double click, go to the editor tab, and the texture preview size, we'll put this at, let's say, 2K, and now the image is much clearer. Also, the galaxy is facing the wrong direction compared to the original, so let's go to the disk shape, set the orientation to Z- instead. The final step to the positioning of the galaxy is to jump out of our camera. We can see it way out there. Let's put that disk as a child of the same null object which is holding the camera. So now if I zoom out even further here and just scrub through the timeline, you can see the galaxy is moving with our camera, which means its relative position when we're looking through the camera will stay the same. So it has no parallax and it will appear as if it's way out there in the distance. And crucially, for our looping to work, that's the setup we need to do. In older versions of Cinema 4D, the landscape object behaves differently. If I bring a new one in, let's go to display with lines again. First of all, it's a different color, but more importantly, its anchor point, the point at which you move it around, rotate it like this and scale it and such, is not at the base. It's somewhere in the middle. So before you continue with this, and let's just make it the same as the one in version 21, 40 segments, let's remove the Fong tag. and I will make it roughly the same size. Before I continue, I will always have to look at its height, its Y height, which I will set myself up here to 300. If I want its anchor point to be at the base, I have to create a new null object, place the landscape inside of here, and whatever the height is here, that's the Y position of the landscape needs to be half that. So in this case, it's going to be 300 divided by 2, which gives me 150. So now the null object is like the main object, and I can do things like scaling here, rotating, and that will be from that base point down here. And by the way, the shortcut for bringing up rotation is R on the keyboard, and for scaling it's T, which I guess stands for transforming. But I just wanted to cover this in case anybody is using, you know, older versions of Cinema 4D, and this is what you would then drop into the cloner when building the side sections in their scene. We are now going to start the lighting of our scene in Cinema 4D, and this is where we begin to develop the look and style of the animation. There are actually no real lights in this scene. The entire look is based on reflection. So if I jump back to Cinema 4D, I will double click to create a new material. Let's go to the color channel, set this to black, and then I will go to reflectance and turn off the default specular, and I will add a reflection legacy instead. Let's lower the roughness all the way down to 0, as well as specular. The reflection strength will stay at 100. The attenuation will be set to additive. Okay, and we can quickly apply this to our objects, so the floor itself, and we can just do this into the interface. It should apply correctly. And if we're not sure, we can just apply this to the various objects up here instead. Let's do a quick preview render to the picture viewer. By default, Cinema 4D has this default light. That's why the character is currently visible and not a silhouette like we have here. So what I will do is go to the lights. Let's grab a new light, and I just set this intensity in the general settings to 0. And this will reset all of the lighting in the scene. Now everything is dark now, so we have to go back to our galaxy material and move this image from the color channel to luminance. So I can just click and hold on this, drag over the luminance channel and drop it in the texture section. Let's enable the luminance channel and turn off color, and also turn off reflectance. That will now light up our scene once again. But really it's just a reflection. I can see this hard edge though, which doesn't look very nice. Let's go to our galaxy once again and make some changes. One, I want to make the galaxy more colorful. So in the luminance channel, if I drop down on the texture, let's put this inside of a filter. So it's at this first level down here. And in the filter, we can do some effects such as increase the saturation. So this will be set to 25. And I will take this same layer, so just drop down, copy shader, and go to the alpha channel and paste this here. This time I don't need the saturation to be anything, so just set this to 0. And instead, let's turn on colorize, which will make this black and white, you know, for use as an alpha channel. I will then enable clipping, and the low clip will be set to 10%. And what this does is any value below 10% will be clipped down to black. And for the high clip, I will do the opposite. I will bring it down to about 65%, which means that any value of gray above 65% will be clipped to 100% white. And this is going to create this nice looking alpha channel for our galaxy material. You can already see this in the picture viewer. If I render this out, once again, it looks much brighter and colorful than before, and we now have this nice fade off instead of that hard edge that we had before. The next step to the lighting is to add some more depth and dimension to our scene, and we're going to do this using the fog and atmosphere effects in Cinema 4D. So to create the fog, we will jump back to our scene and let's get a physical sky. I want to see the changes as I make them here, so I am going to enable the interactive render region by pressing Alt and R. It will open up this part of your viewport and it will do a preview render of what the scene looks like. Let's put the quality slider all the way up to the top, and we could maybe make the window itself a bit larger. Okay, so with our physical sky, let's go to the basic tab. Let's turn off sky and sun, but enable fog. And I just wait for that to update. Let's go to the fog tab and make some changes. So in the color, it's going to be blue, and then the saturation and brightness would just be at 100%. I'm going to set the start height to -5000 and the end height to 2000. These are the settings I used in the original project. But once again, you can actually try different settings and see what you can come up with. And for the density, I will set this to 80%. I'm going to also adjust my camera here, but as far as the fog settings are concerned, that's it actually. It's very straightforward. If I disable this interactive window, let's make a copy of the camera. So just hold Control and drag down and look through this new camera. I will lower the position to 60 and angle it up more. So instead of 20, let's have 25. And I just want to move the galaxy closer to the center of the frame. So this is before and this is after. So as far as the fog and atmosphere effects, that's it. But let me show you a glitch which is going to happen anytime you use the fog effect in Cinema 4D. If I close this project, so go to File and Close, and then reopen it again, so under Recent Files, it's this one at the top. If I just open this up and start rendering, you will immediately see that the fog effect does not appear correct. That's because anytime you use the fog effect in Cinema 4D and close and reopen a project, the fog effect does not load correctly. You always have to go to it and change one of these values by a unit, change it back to what it's supposed to be, and then it will render correctly. Now, this is not something you want to be doing all the time you reopen a project. So the solution is to animate one of these values slightly. So at frame 0, I will go to the start height and let's just change it down by 1 unit. So -4999. Keyframe this, move forward 1 frame and set it back to what it's supposed to be, which is -5000, and then I will save that keyframe. And what this means is that each time this project reopens, this animated value will force the fog effect to reset and reinitialize properly, and then it's always going to be rendered correctly after that first frame. It means that we may have to cut out that first frame from all subsequent renders of this animation, but that's actually okay because this is a loop. So the first frame is actually identical to the last frame in the animation. So these frames are repeated anyway. So if we have to cut out one of them, it may as well be the frame that renders incorrectly because of that one odd glitch in Cinema 4D. It's been around